Hey, welcome back. Tonight I want to tell you about two women who did something that almost no person in recorded history has ever managed to do. And then I want to tell you, slowly, carefully, and in full, what the world did to them for it. You probably have a general idea of what the Golden Age of Piracy looked like. You have some image in your mind of black flags and Caribbean water and men with pistols stuffed into their belts. You know the outline of the story. But the history of pirates, the real history, the one that sits in court records and jail manifests and the letters of colonial governors, has a chapter that almost never gets read all the way through. It is the chapter that begins when the adventure ends. The chapter that starts the moment a woman is dragged off a ship in chains and placed before a court that has no adequate category for what she is. A court that looks at her across the room and sees not a criminal, exactly, but something far more disturbing than any criminal could be. A woman who refused to stay where she was put. What happened to female pirates after capture is one of the most disturbing and least fully told chapters in the history of the sea. Not because of the violence, though there was violence. Not because of the injustice, though the injustice was profound. But because of the specific quality of what was being punished. These women were not punished simply for what they had done. They were punished for what they represented. They were punished for the demonstration they had made. The demonstration that the walls built around women's lives were not inherent, not natural, not unbreachable. And the system that punished them needed to answer that demonstration as comprehensively as it could. Because if the answer was insufficient, other women might look at the horizon and think the same thoughts. So it answered. It answered with stone cells and inadequate food and fevers in the tropical heat, and records that simply go silent where a woman's name should be. It answered with stocks in public squares and brands on skin and prolonged imprisonment that the records could blame on illness rather than on the court. It answered by making the cost so visible, so comprehensive, so sustained, that no one who heard the story could miss the message. This is what waits for you if you try. They tried anyway, and 300 years later we are still talking about them. Which means, in the most important sense, the system's answer was not sufficient. Tonight we are going back to the Caribbean at the turn of the 18th century. We are going to spend a long time there, moving slowly through everything that happened, from the world that made these women possible, to the lives they lived before the sea, to the night it all ended, to the courtrooms and the prisons and the silence in the records and the question that still does not have a fully satisfying answer. Where did Anne Bonny go? What killed Mary Read? What was the legal system of the early 1700s actually trying to protect when it treated female pirates so differently from male ones? These are the questions. Let us take them slowly. Before we begin, if you find yourself drawn into these stories the way I hope you will, please consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a like if it moves you to. And I am genuinely curious, where in the world are you right now? What does your night look like from where you are? Drop it in the comments. There are people listening to this in places I would never imagine. All of them in the dark. All of them being told the same story tonight. I love knowing that. Dim the lights if they are not already dim. Let your breath slow down. Let your shoulders drop an inch or two away from your ears. You do not need to hold anything tonight. Just listen. Let the story come to you. We are going back to the Caribbean to understand why the story of female pirates matters in the specific way that it does, not just as adventure, not just as biography, but as a window into how power works and how it defends itself. You have to first understand the world in which it happened. You have to understand the Caribbean in the early 1700s as a specific geography with specific characteristics that made it unlike anywhere else in the Atlantic world. Because the reason pirates thrived there is the same reason women could be among them. And the reason the empire reacted so strongly when it caught them is rooted in everything about what the Caribbean represented to the powers that claimed to control it. Picture yourself looking at a map of the Caribbean Sea, not a modern satellite image, a map from 1710, hand-drawn, imprecise at the edges, full of blank spaces where no one had measured carefully enough to be confident. Start at the southern tip, where the chain of the Lesser Antilles rises up from the water in a long curving arc from Trinidad northward toward the Virgin Islands. Then sweep your eye west across the larger islands, Puerto Rico, Hispaniola, Jamaica, Cuba, and feel how the water between them creates passages and channels that run in every direction. Now think about the size of it. The Caribbean Sea covers nearly 1 million square miles of open water. It is dotted with hundreds of islands and thousands of cays and countless passages too shallow for a large warship to navigate, but perfectly accessible to a shallow draft sloop that knows where it is going. Why does this geography matter so fundamentally? Because geography is not neutral. Geography shapes what is possible. In the Caribbean of 1710, the British Empire claimed Jamaica. The Spanish claimed Cuba and most of the mainland. The French held portions of Hispaniola and a scattering of smaller islands. The Dutch were present wherever the other three were inattentive. Every one of these powers had a flag and a governor and a set of laws, and an intention to control what moved through these waters. None of them had the means to do it. A 74-gun ship of the line could destroy any vessel it caught in open water, but catching a shallow draft pirate sloop that could cut through reef passages and disappear into mangrove channels was a different problem entirely. The geometry of the place made law enforcement nearly impossible. The Caribbean was simply too large, too complex, too honeycombed with hiding places for any naval force of the era to effectively patrol. Think about what this meant for the people who understood it. Think about what it meant to know the reef passages and the anchorages and the hidden bays that did not appear on official charts. Think about what it meant to have a vessel that could go where warships could not follow. The Caribbean's geography was not just a convenience for pirates. It was the fundamental enabling condition for everything the Golden Age of Piracy produced. And the Golden Age, by the measures available to us, was extraordinary. Between 1650 and 1730, thousands of pirates operated across the Caribbean and the Atlantic coast and the waters of West Africa. At the height of it, in the years around 1715 to 1718, Nassau in the Bahamas had become something with no historical precedent, a harbour town governed by pirates, operating on principles that no legitimate government of the era had managed to implement, answering to no king and to no company, belonging to everyone who signed the articles and no one who had not. That wealth flowing through the Caribbean was the other side of this geography. Sugar, tobacco, cotton, rum, enslaved people being transported from the coasts of West Africa to the plantations of the New World. Silver from the Spanish Main. Manufactured goods from England. The trade routes were rivers of value moving in all directions through water that could not be adequately policed. A merchant vessel sailing from Barbados to London carried months of work in its hold. A merchant vessel crossing from Jamaica to the Carolina colonies carried cargo that would make several fortunes if it arrived, and could make other fortunes if it did not. Pirates understood this arithmetic with perfect clarity. They did not raid randomly. They sat at the choke points, the Windward Passage, the Florida Strait, the Yucatan Channel, and they waited for ships heavy with cargo and light on guns to come drifting through. Picture yourself standing at the bow of a pirate sloop at first light, somewhere in the passage between Cuba and Hispaniola. The water is the colour of green glass, where it shallows over the reef to your right, and then suddenly deep blue where it drops away. The air is already warm, the tropics never fully cooling even in the hours before dawn. Behind you, a dozen men are moving quietly, some checking weapons, some adjusting rigging, some still sleeping in hammocks below deck, who will be needed if the morning produces what the captain expects. On the horizon, barely visible, is the silhouette of a merchant vessel moving with the wind. She is not moving fast. She has no reason to be moving fast, because as far as her captain knows, these are safe waters on a calm morning, and his ship is not a warship, but a merchant brig carrying sugar to a colonial port, and there is nothing about this morning that suggests danger. What drove men to this life in these numbers? The answer is a great deal less romantic than the popular image of it. Most of the men who became pirates in the Golden Age were not adventurers seeking treasure. They were working sailors who had been treated so badly by the systems they served that piracy, with all its risks, represented an improvement on their previous conditions. A Royal Navy sailor in 1710 could be flogged for minor infractions at an officer's discretion. He could be pressed into service against his will. He could serve for years without guaranteed pay, without any compensation if he lost a limb in battle, without any right of appeal against a captain who chose to mistreat him. A merchant sailor had slightly more freedom, but not much. His wages were set by the captain's discretion. He had no legal recourse when money was withheld. He had nothing if he was injured. He was, in the words of one historian, not much better than a piece of equipment that the ship's owner needed to maintain at minimum cost. And then there was the pirate ship, which offered something neither the navy nor the merchant fleet could offer. It offered a voice. Every pirate crew operated under a set of written rules called articles, and these articles were drafted collectively and signed by every man before the voyage began. The captain was elected. The quartermaster, who represented the crew's interests against the captain, was elected. Major decisions about where to sail and what to attack were made by majority vote. The plunder was divided according to a set formula that was agreed upon in advance. The captain typically received 2 shares to an ordinary sailor's one, which was a far smaller disparity than anything in legitimate maritime employment. Men who were injured in battle received compensation from a common fund before anyone else received their share. Lost a right arm, you received 600 pieces of 8. Lost a left leg, 500. These disability provisions predated any national workers' compensation program by over a century. Imagine what this must have felt like to a man who had spent years in a system where he had no voice and no rights. Imagine arriving in Nassau and finding a community where the rules were made by the people who lived under them, where no officer could flog you without due process, where you owned a share of what you earned and you knew in advance what that share would be, where if you were hurt doing the work, the community took care of you. The pirate articles were a social contract of a kind that the legitimate world of 1715 simply did not offer to ordinary sailors. They were, by the standards of the age, shockingly democratic. And that democracy had a consequence that almost nobody mentions, because it complicates a story that most people prefer to keep simple. The democracy of Nassau, the democracy embedded in the pirate articles, it did not specify gender. Women came to Nassau too, not in large numbers, but enough that the records acknowledge their presence. Women who had run out of options in the world the Empire offered. Women who had ended up in Nassau's orbit through various paths, some attached to pirate captains, some arrived independently. Some having made their way there after the specific failures and losses that left a woman in the early 18th century with nothing the legitimate world would recognise as a viable life. The articles, so far as we know, did not contain a provision excluding them from voting or from shares. Some women signed. Some women sailed, and in the specific lawless democracy of Nassau, that was treated as an interesting fact rather than an impossibility. The presence of women among pirate crews was not celebrated by most captains. Bartholomew Roberts, the most successful pirate of the Golden Age, explicitly prohibited women aboard his ships in his articles, not on moral grounds, but on the cold, practical grounds that women caused jealousy and conflict among men who had been at sea for months. Many pirate codes contained similar provisions. But provisions are not the same as practice. They got broken. And when they got broken, the records occasionally preserve what followed. Which brings us to the women whose stories we have come here to tell. The specific threat that a woman on a pirate ship represented, the threat that the colonial system responded to with such disproportionate energy when it caught them, was not the violence. Men were violent. The piracy alone did not explain the reaction. What a woman on a pirate ship represented was a demonstration that the world had assigned her a role and she had declined it, that the walls built around female life in the early 18th century were not inherent features of reality but constructed boundaries, and that a woman who decided to step across them could in fact step across them. That demonstration, if it spread, if other women heard about it and thought about it and arrived at the same conclusion, was worth far more in danger to the social order than any cargo that had ever been stolen from a merchant vessel. The Empire understood this, and its response when it finally caught up with these women reflected exactly how seriously it took the threat. Anne Bonny arrived in the world already marked. She was born around 1697 in County Cork in Ireland, and the first fact about her life is the one that shaped everything that followed. Her father was a lawyer named William Cormac. Her mother was a servant in his household. Anne was the product of their affair. And in early 18th century Ireland, illegitimacy was not merely a social inconvenience. It was a brand. It altered how every room received you. It altered what futures were available to you. It sat on a child like a visible stain that the child had done nothing to earn. Think about what that early life must have felt like. Picture a child in County Cork at the turn of the century, growing up in a household where her own existence was the evidence of something shameful, where the story of how she came to be was a story her family could not tell directly, where the world she was being prepared for, marriage, respectability, social acceptance, required her to somehow be other than what she was. The illegitimate daughter of a lawyer and his servant carried a story that would not be set aside simply because everyone agreed not to mention it. It was there in the way people looked, in the things that were not said, in the futures that were quietly closed. William Cormac made the decision that many men of his time and station made when scandal became too heavy for the life they had built. He left. He packed up his circumstances, took Anne and her mother, and sailed for the American colonies. Charleston, in the colony of South Carolina. A new place, a new beginning, a context where the specifics of County Cork were not known and did not follow. He was a capable man, and the new world rewarded capability. He set himself up as a merchant and then as a plantation owner. He prospered. By the time Anne was growing up in Charleston, her father was a man of substance in his community. He had rebuilt what the affair had threatened to cost him. He had done so by moving, and he had done so by building a new story around himself and his family. The story he needed Anne to participate in was a familiar one. She was the daughter of a prosperous Charleston merchant. She would marry someone appropriate. Her life would be quiet and respectable, and properly contained within the world that her father had worked to construct around her. These were not cruel expectations. They were the standard expectations for a daughter of her class in her era. The problem was not that the expectations were unreasonable. The problem was that Anne was not built for them. Every account we have of her, even accounts written by people who disapproved of her, even accounts shaped by the particular lens of 18th century moralism, contains this consistent quality. She was fierce. She pushed against limits instinctively, the way some people push against the edge of any container they find themselves placed in, not because they have thought carefully about the pushing, but because the container itself is intolerable to them. There is a story, possibly embellished, that she once stabbed a servant girl who had provoked her. Whether or not this specific incident happened exactly as reported, it is the kind of story that attached itself to Anne and stuck, because it was consistent with the person the records describe. She had a temper. She had force. She was not someone the world could successfully minimize. When she was around 16 or 17 years old, she married a man named James Bonney. James Bonney was a sailor. He had some connection to the pirate world, enough to move in those circles, enough to know people who lived outside the law. Anne had imagined, or perhaps hoped without fully imagining, that marrying James Bonney was a step toward freedom. A step toward a larger life than the Charleston merchant's daughter was supposed to have. She was catastrophically wrong. James Bonney was not a gateway to freedom. He was a petty man who made his living informing on his fellow pirates to the governor of the Bahamas in exchange for small rewards. He was a man who used proximity to lawlessness to sustain a very small and very safe version of himself. Anne had married the wrong kind of sailor entirely. Her father disowned her when the marriage became known. This was a blow that did not, apparently, deter her from anything. William Cormac washed his hands of his daughter and perhaps believed that this was punishment enough, that the social and financial consequences of being disowned would bring Anne back to her senses. But Anne Bonney's senses were not the kind that respond to financial pressure by becoming more conventional. They were the kind that respond by looking for the next available direction. Nassau in 1718 was unlike anything else in the Western world. Picture a harbour town that has simply collapsed into lawlessness, and then, in that lawlessness, built something new. The original British colonial apparatus had abandoned the Bahamas almost entirely. The fort was crumbling. The legitimate settlers were few and struggling, and into this vacuum, over the previous few years, pirates had flooded. By 1718, Nassau held perhaps 1,000 pirates, and the community they had built around themselves. Ships came in with their stolen cargo and left with provisions and rum. Men walked the streets with weapons they did not bother to conceal. The taverns stayed open all night, and the conversations in them were the conversations of people who had stepped outside the system that governed the rest of the world. There was something real in Nassau that the legitimate world did not offer. You could feel it in the way men moved there, in the way decisions were made communally, in the specific absence of the deference that colonial life required at every turn. Nassau was not paradise. It was often brutal and frequently dangerous, and the life expectancy of the average Nassau pirate was not long. But it was free in a way that Anne Bonney, arriving from the unhappy marriage to the petty informant, had never encountered before, and it was in Nassau that she met Calico Jack Rackham. Imagine you are Anne Bonney in the summer of 1718. You are 21 years old, or thereabouts. You have been disowned by your father. You are married to a man you have lost all respect for. The life you stepped into when you married James Bonney, hoping it would lead somewhere larger, has instead revealed itself to be smaller even than the life you were trying to escape. You have arrived in Nassau because Nassau is where James Bonney's world is, and Nassau is at least interesting in ways that Charleston was not. You spend time in the taverns and on the wharves, because there is nowhere else to go that does not make the smallness more apparent. And there, across some low-ceilinged room smelling of rum and sea, is a man in bright-coloured calico cloth. John Rackham was not the greatest pirate of his era. He was not the most feared or the most successful. The prizes he took were modest: fishing sloops, small trading vessels, the occasional lightly armed merchant brig. He never commanded a fleet. He never blockaded a port. He never threatened a naval installation. What Rackham had, in quantities that exceeded most of his contemporaries, was a specific quality that is genuinely rare in any era. He took Anne seriously. He listened to her the way you listen to someone whose opinion you actually want to know. He did not look at her and see the category she was supposed to occupy. He looked at her and saw something worth paying attention to. They began an affair. James Bonney discovered it and did what petty informants do when they feel they have been wronged. He went to the governor and tried to have Anne arrested for adultery. The law was entirely on his side. Anne Bonney, as his wife, was his legal property. Her body, her choices, her presence in any room, all of it was subject to his authority under the law of the era. The governor could have had her punished. He had the standing to do so, but by this point, the particular circumstances of Nassau meant that the governor's authority was itself uncertain, and the moment was one in which enforcement was not as straightforward as the law technically permitted. Anne and Calico Jack did not wait to find out how it would resolve. They stole a ship. They sailed out of Nassau harbour in the early hours of a morning in 1718, and they did not look back. Anne Bonney left behind her father, her husband, her disownment, her scandal, the life that had been shrinking around her for as long as she could remember. She sailed into the Caribbean as a member of a pirate crew, and everything that followed, the months on the water, the raids, the daily reality of what piracy actually was, and ultimately the night in October 1720 when Jonathan Barnett found them in Dry Harbour Bay, everything followed from that morning's decision. Life on a pirate sloop was not romantic. Think about what it actually required. A sloop of the era was not large, perhaps 60 feet of deck, perhaps 30 feet of beam. A crew of 12 or 15 people shared this space. They slept in hammocks below deck, in a space that was low-ceilinged and dark and smelled of bilge water and human bodies and whatever cargo was currently in the hold. They ate from a shared pot whatever was available, which was often dried meat and hardtack, and whatever fruit or provisions they had most recently taken from a prize. They worked the ropes and the sails in heat that was relentless, in rain squalls that came without warning, in the specific physical demand of keeping a wooden ship operational in tropical waters. To earn and keep respect in this environment as a woman, in 1718, required something extraordinary. It required being capable in precisely the ways the crew recognised and valued. It required not flinching. It required showing up when the work needed to be done, and showing up particularly when the work was dangerous. Every account of Anne Bonney among Calico Jack's crew is consistent on this point. She fought. She was not kept separate from the violence of the work. She participated in raids. She carried weapons and used them. She was, by every testimony available to us from people who witnessed her operate, one of the most capable fighters on the ship. This was not charming to the world she had left, but on the water, in the specific democracy of a pirate crew where your standing depended on what you could do, it was exactly what the situation required. The crew raided small vessels along the Jamaican coast through most of 1720. They were not pulling off spectacular heists. They were stealing from fishing boats and small trading sloops, taking cargo and rum and whatever else their targets carried. The prizes were modest. But the rhythm of the life was what it was, days on open water, nights at anchor in hidden bays, the particular freedom of existing outside the maps of the people who claimed to govern these waters. For Anne, for the month this lasted, it was the largest her life had ever been, and she would pay for that largeness specifically and deliberately when the time came. Mary Read's story is stranger than Anne Bonny's in almost every way. Stranger in its origins, stranger in the shape it took across her life, stranger in the specific form of courage it required. And it is, in some ways, more devastating in what it reveals about what the world offered women in this era. Because Mary Read was not someone who stumbled into the margins of the law. She was someone whom the law had pushed there from the very beginning by giving her no viable alternative. She was born in England, probably around 1685, which would make her roughly a decade older than Anne. The date is uncertain because her birth was not recorded formally. It was not recorded formally because her birth was, from the beginning, something that someone was trying to conceal. Her father was a sailor who had gone to sea and simply never returned, which in this era was not unusual enough to be particularly remarkable, the sea being what it was. Her mother was left alone with a young daughter and no means of supporting either of them. In early 18th century England, a widow without property or family of means faced a narrow set of options: begging, domestic service, or something worse. None of these kept a child fed and clothed across the years it would take for that child to be able to work for herself. Mary's mother had had another child before Mary, a legitimate son from the marriage. A boy who had died young. That boy's death had ended a specific stream of financial support. His father's mother had been sending money to help raise her grandson. When the boy died, the money stopped. Mary's mother was facing the complete collapse of what little stability she had. And so she made a decision that seems extraordinary from where we stand. But that had a logic rooted in desperate practical necessity. She dressed Mary as a boy. She told the grandmother that the boy was still alive, that Mary was him. The grandmother's visits were infrequent enough that the deception could be maintained if it was maintained carefully. The money kept coming. What this decision meant for Mary Read, for the child growing up in this constructed identity, is almost impossible to fully inhabit from the outside. She learned to be a boy, not in a superficial costume party way, but in the deep structural way that comes from spending your entire developmental years as something. She learned how boys move through space, with a different sense of their own right to occupy it, a different relationship to the bodies around them, a different set of permissions. She learned how boys talk, how they resolve conflicts, how they establish standing among other boys. She learned how the world responds to a boy versus how it responds to a girl, and she learned it through the most direct possible method, which is living both sides of that difference. The practical education this gave her was extraordinary, because what she was learning underneath the specific lessons of boy behaviour was something more fundamental. She was learning that gender was performed, that the world treated you according to what it perceived you to be, and what it perceived you to be was shaped by signals you sent, deliberately or otherwise. She was learning, without anyone naming it this way, that the categories the world used to sort people and determine their options were not as fixed as those categories presented themselves. She was learning that you could work with the categories, or you could walk around them. The lesson would serve her for the rest of her life. When the grandmother died and the money stopped anyway, Mary was old enough to work. The disguise had become, by this point, simply who she was. She did not know how to be a girl. She had never been a girl in any public sense. She had no repertoire for it, no practiced ease in it, no history of moving through the world in that role. What she had was a practiced ease in being a man, and so she used it. She found work as a footboy on a ship. The work was brutal, scrubbing decks, hauling cargo, climbing rigging in weather that had no patience for the inexperienced. But she was tough. Growing up in the specific conditions she had grown up in had produced toughness as inevitably as it had produced anything else. She eventually enlisted in the British military. The War of the Spanish Succession was underway in Flanders, the conflict that would grind on until 1714 and consume tens of thousands of lives in the mud and fortifications of the Low Countries. Mary Read enlisted as a soldier and was sent to the front. Think about what this means. This was not a desk assignment. This was not a support role. This was active military service in one of the most sustained and brutal conflicts of the early 18th century, fought in conditions that were wet and cold and disease-ridden and intermittently violent in the specific ways that 18th century warfare was violent. Mary Read was in it. She served. She fought in actual battles. She survived. In the army, she fell in love, not with a woman, with a fellow soldier, a man. She revealed her identity to him privately. He accepted her. They married. This was the extraordinary thing about this period of her life. Not just that she found love, but that she found it in the specific form of being known and accepted as she actually was. They left the military together and set up a small inn near Breda in the Netherlands, and for a brief period Mary Read lived openly as a woman, running the inn. Married, visible, that period of open life was, by the accounts available, genuinely happy. It did not last. Her husband died young. The records are not specific about how, only that he died. The inn failed. The brief window of legitimate domestic happiness closed, and Mary Read was back where the world had always seemed intent on returning her. A widow in early 18th century Europe, with no money, no property, no family of means, no business. Her options were the same options her mother had faced when she was born. Begging, service, or something worse. She looked at those options. She looked at the world that had made them her options, and she did the only thing that her particular life had prepared her to do well. She put the man's clothes back on. She boarded a ship bound for the West Indies. And somewhere in the Caribbean, that ship was captured by pirates. She joined the crew. Imagine the specific quality of reasoning that decision required. A captured ship, surrounded by men who had taken it. Most passengers on a captured vessel faced a limited set of choices: comply, resist and risk death, or try to negotiate. Mary Read saw a different option. She saw a community that operated outside the social categories that had boxed her life into its smallest possible dimensions. She saw the articles and the voting and the share system, though she probably did not know those specific words yet. She saw men making decisions about their own lives in a way that the world she had come from did not permit to people without wealth or rank. And she signed on. Eventually she ended up on Calico Jack's sloop. And there she met Anne Bonny. What passed between these two women, what they said to each other in the first weeks of their acquaintance, what they recognised in each other, what they built together, is not preserved in any document that has survived. The records capture their actions, but not their conversations. Their choices are documented. Their inner lives are not. Some historians have proposed that the bond between them was romantic. Some argue for friendship of the deepest kind. Some say they simply recognised in each other the same quality, a specific bone-level refusal to accept the life the world had written for them. And that recognition was its own kind of communion, requiring no other category. Whatever the specific nature of it, the bond was real. It made them a unit. and when the moment of crisis came, when everything collapsed on a night in October 1720, they were standing together on the deck of a sloop in Dry Harbour Bay, and everyone else was hiding below. The night of October 22nd, 1720, was not supposed to be different from any other night. There was no omen in the morning, no particular tension that would have told anyone paying attention that this was the last day of a specific version of freedom. Calico Jack's crew had recently taken a Spanish vessel, and the mood aboard their sloop was the mood of men who have just had a run of good luck and are enjoying it with the particular commitment of people who know that good luck does not always last. They were drinking. They had been drinking for hours, possibly since midday, working through the rum they had acquired in their most recent prizes. By the time the sun went down over the Western Caribbean on October 22nd, most of the men on that sloop were below deck, and the state they were in was the state that several hours of celebration-grade rum drinking produces. The sloop was anchored in Dry Harbour Bay, off the western tip of Jamaica. It was a quiet anchorage, sheltered, the kind of place a small crew chose when they wanted to rest and resupply and not be found. The bay offered cover on three sides. The water was calm. The night was dark, in the way that Caribbean nights are dark when you are away from any settlement, the kind of dark that makes the stars overhead very present, and makes everything at the level of the water surface invisible unless it is very close or very loud. Jonathan Barnett had been looking for them for weeks. He was a privateer, which is the careful word for someone who commits acts on the water that in different company would be called piracy, but who does so with a license from a colonial government which transforms crime into service. Governor Nicholas Laws of Jamaica had commissioned Barnett specifically for this purpose. Laws had a problem that was partly practical and partly political. The Golden Age of Piracy was supposed to be winding down. The British government had issued pardons. The Royal Navy had been reorganised. The Admiralty courts in the colonies had been given expanded authority to try pirates without sending them to London for trial. The message being sent to piracy as a phenomenon was that the era of tolerance was over. But Calico Jack's crew kept appearing in Jamaican waters, raiding small vessels, threatening fishing boats, making the governor's proclamation that order had been restored look increasingly hollow. In September 1720, Laws issued a formal declaration naming Jack and his crew enemies of the Crown. Barnett received his commission and began his search. Finding a specific sloop in the Caribbean of 1720 was not as simple as looking at the obvious places. The water was full of islands, and the islands were full of bays, and the bays were full of smaller inlets and channels, where a 30-foot sloop could sit completely invisible to anyone not specifically looking for it in that precise location. But Barnett had the advantage that all effective huntermen have across all eras, which is information. Someone had seen them. Someone knew the general area where they were operating, and Barnett's vessel was a sloop itself, the same class of shallow-draft, manoeuvrable vessel that gave pirates their advantage over warships. He could go where they went. He could sit in bays they thought were private. He could appear in the dark of Dry Harbour Bay at a moment when no one aboard Rackham's sloop was in a condition to deal with his appearance. Picture yourself on the deck of that sloop at the moment before Barnett's vessel separated from the darkness. You are one of the few people still above deck. Most of the crew is below. The night is warm and still, and the water barely moves against the hull. The stars overhead are extraordinary, the way stars are in the tropics away from lights. You're watching the water, or maybe not watching anything in particular, maybe simply sitting with the warm rum heaviness of the evening and the specific comfort of a sheltered anchorage after weeks at sea. And then something changes at the edge of the visible, a shape that is different from the shapes that should be there, a silhouette that does not belong to the dark water or the distant land. Barnett's vessel came alongside. He called for surrender. Calico Jack, according to the accounts that survive, began to negotiate, which was itself a kind of answer, because a captain who's ready to fight does not begin with negotiation. He begins with fire. and before any negotiation could develop far enough to matter, a cannon blast from Barnett's ship tore through the rigging of Jack's sloop. A heavy ball, aimed at the rig rather than the hull, designed to cripple rather than sink. The crack of it would have been enormous in the still night air, felt as much as heard. And in the minutes that followed, Barnett's men began coming over the rail. Below deck, Rackham's crew heard the cannon, and they stayed below. Think about what this means. Sit with it for a moment, because it is important. These were men who had chosen piracy in part because of the specific courage it was supposed to require. These were men who had signed articles that explicitly said that desertion during battle was punishable by death or marooning. The article was there because the article's writers knew cowardice was a real possibility and wanted to create a formal deterrent for it. And yet when the moment arrived, when the cannon fired and the bootsteps of boarders hit the rail above their heads, most of them chose the bottom of the ship. They were too drunk to fight, some of them. They were too frightened, others. They were both, most of them. What happens on the deck of that sloop in those minutes is one of the most striking images in the history of piracy. Two people standing above the men who were supposed to be standing there. Two people who had been told, by birth, by law, by the entire social architecture of the world they came from, that the deck in a fight was not their place. Anne Bonny and Mary Red were the only ones fighting. Mary screamed at the men below. One account says she discharged a pistol down through the hatch, trying to force them upward by threat since conscience had clearly failed. She called them cowards. She used words that the court records in Spanish Town would later describe in tones of barely concealed shock, because women were not supposed to have access to those words. We're not supposed to use them with that kind of authority. We're not supposed to be the people on a pirate crew making the assessment of who had failed. They fought boarders who outnumbered them with an advantage that had only one possible resolution. Anne with pistols and a cutlass, Mary with whatever was closest to hand. They held the deck for as long as two people against many trained sailors could hold it, and that was not very long. Perhaps 10 minutes from the first cannon shot to the moment of capture, perhaps less. The accounts are not precise about the timeline. What they are precise about is the sequence. The men stayed below, the women fought, the fighting ended with Anne and Mary in chains, the rest of the crew dragged up from the dark of the hold, all of them transported to Spanish Town, Jamaica, to face the Admiralty Court. The journey from Dry Harbour Bay to Spanish Town was not long by nautical measure, but think about what it must have been like to make it in chains, to be on a vessel that was moving toward a fate you understood very clearly. Anne Bonny had spent time in Nassau. She knew what happened to pirates who were caught and tried and convicted. She had seen the gibbets. She had heard the stories. Mary Read had lived long enough in the world, had done enough dangerous things, had survived enough close calls to be under no illusions about what a colonial admiralty court produced when it received a pirate crew. Both women knew what was coming, and I think both of them, in those hours on the water between capture and the first sight of the Spanish Town courthouse, were doing the specific kind of calculation that people do when the situation is not good but has not yet become final. Looking at the options, counting what they still had to work with, deciding how to walk into what was coming. The Admiralty Court at Spanish Town was not a subtle institution. It was not designed for the kind of deliberation that produces uncertain outcomes. It was a colonial machine for processing a specific type of threat to imperial order, and it processed that threat with the efficiency that imperial machines develop when they have enough practice. Pirates were tried here regularly by 1720. The procedures were settled, the outcomes were reliably predictable. The court sat, evidence was presented, men were convicted, and men were hanged. That was the rhythm. The efficiency of it was itself part of the message. There was no point in hoping that the slowness of justice would work in your favour. Justice here was not slow. The courthouse at Spanish Town occupied a position in the town that made its authority visible. Crowds gathered for piracy trials in this era, not simply from morbid curiosity, but because these proceedings were public spectacles designed to be witnessed, designed to communicate the power of the Crown to anyone who needed to understand what happened when that power was defied. The trial of Calico Jack Rackham and his crew had drawn attention from across the Caribbean. Newspapers in Jamaica covered the proceedings. The story had already reached London by the time the trial was underway. People fought for seats in the gallery, street vendors set up outside. It was theatre, with an audience that knew what the ending was going to be, and attended anyway, because the specifics of how the ending arrived were the point of the performance. The male members of the crew were tried first, beginning November 16th, 1720. The evidence against them was extensive and essentially uncontested. Multiple witnesses testified about the raids and the stolen cargo, and the threats made to merchant crews who found themselves in the path of Jack's sloop. The goods taken from various prizes were identified and presented. The defence, such as it was, consisted largely of silence, not because the men had nothing to say, but because there was nothing useful to say, because the evidence was overwhelming, and the arguments available were not strong enough to matter. The verdict arrived quickly, guilty. The sentence arrived with it, death by hanging. Calico Jack was hanged on November 18th, 1720, 2 days after the trial began. The speed of this should not be underestimated as a deliberate quality. 2 days from first hearing to execution. The Empire did not want to give anyone in the Caribbean time to think of reasons why the execution should not proceed. The body was placed in a gibbet immediately after death, an iron cage designed to hold a corpse in public view, positioned at a small island at the entrance to Port Royal Harbour, where every ship coming into port would see it. The point of the gibbet was not the cage, the point was the viewing. Sailors entering one of the most important harbours in the British Caribbean would see the rotting remains of a man who had challenged imperial authority, and they would understand what challenging imperial authority produced, and they would carry that understanding with them to wherever they went next. Anne Bonny visited Jack before his execution. She was permitted a final meeting, the details of which the records preserve only in what she said to him. According to contemporary accounts, she told him that she was sorry to see him there, but that if he had fought like a man, he need not have been hanged like a dog. This is one of the most extraordinary things said aloud by any person in this entire story. Think about what it contains. No grief. No softening for the condemned man's benefit. No performance of the feminine sorrow that the watching world expected from a woman in this position. There is instead a cold, lucid assessment of how he had failed. She is standing in front of a man she has sailed with for 2 years, a man she has been willing to steal a ship for, a man she has fought alongside, and she is telling him, clearly and without apology, that his cowardice disgusted her. She is not comforting the dying. She is holding them accountable to the standard she had always held herself to. And that quality, that specific refusal to perform the role the moment asked her to perform, is the thread that runs through everything we know about Anne Bonny from beginning to end. The women's trial was held separately. November 28th, 12 days after the men were convicted. Why 12 days? This is a question worth sitting with. A court that had processed an entire crew in 2 days took 12 days to arrange the trial of the 2 women. The delay is a signal, and the signal is that the court needed time to prepare for something it had not encountered in quite this form before. 2 women who had lived on a pirate crew for months while disguised as men. 2 women who had been identified during the initial proceedings as the only members of the crew who had actively fought during the capture. 2 women who did not, in the first days of their captivity, give any indication of planning to perform remorse for the benefit of the court. The judges needed to think about how to frame what they were about to do. They needed to construct the proceeding carefully. 12 days gave them that. What the questioning of the female defendants revealed about how the court understood this case is preserved in the trial records in a way that is still striking nearly 3 centuries later. Witnesses were asked not just about what Anne and Mary had done, but about what kind of women they were. Had they behaved immodestly aboard ship? Had they used profane language? Had they encouraged the men to violence? Had they engaged in romantic or sexual relationships with members of the crew? Had they worn men's clothing willingly, or had they been coerced into it? Had they shown any reluctance when raids were proposed? Had they expressed remorse at any point? None of these questions were asked of the male defendants. Not one of them. Because for the men, the crime was straightforward. They had committed piracy. A crime against commerce. A crime against the shipping lanes of the empire. For the women, the crime was something else entirely. It was the crime of being the wrong kind of woman, of abandoning their natural character and entering the masculine world of violence and freedom and choice. And the court needed to establish, through the testimony of witnesses, exactly how thoroughly they had abandoned it. The legal framework that produced this distinction was not accidental. It was the product of a specific understanding of what men and women were, built into the law over centuries. Men committed crimes. Women committed sins. When a man turned to piracy, he had broken the law of the crown. When a woman turned to piracy, she had broken something deeper, the natural order as the era understood it, the divinely established hierarchy of gender that gave every social arrangement its legitimacy. A man who stole cargo threatened commerce. A woman who stole cargo, who fought with weapons, who lived freely on the water making her own decisions, she threatened the foundation. And the foundation needed defending more urgently than commerce did. Both women were convicted. The verdict was the same as the verdict for the men, guilty of piracy. The sentence was formally the same, death by hanging. But before the sentence could be carried out, both women said the same 4 words, and in saying them, they changed what happened next. Mary Read's statement to the court, delivered during the proceedings and preserved in the trial record, is worth understanding fully. When asked why she had chosen the life of a pirate, she reportedly replied that the punishment of death was no great hardship, because if it were not for the gallows, every coward would take up piracy and make it impossible for men of courage to earn a living. She was not apologizing. She was not performing contrition. She was not giving the court the broken, repentant woman it needed her to be. She was defending piracy as a profession. She was arguing that the death penalty served a legitimate function, not as a deterrent to her, but as a filter, ensuring that only people of genuine courage entered the trade. She was, in the middle of her own capital trial, making a case for the value of the very law that was about to kill her, from the pirate's perspective. The court transcripts show the judges moving quickly past her statement. It was recorded, because everything was recorded. That was the point of the formal proceeding. But it was not engaged with. It did not fit the narrative the court needed. The court needed fallen women. Women who had been led astray by bad men, by circumstances, by the specific moral failures that women were supposed to be susceptible to. Women who, brought before the law, would return to themselves and demonstrate that the natural order had been temporarily disrupted but had now reasserted its authority. Mary Read was not that woman. She was a warrior who had made specific choices for specific reasons and was prepared to defend those choices all the way to the end. The court had no category for her response. So it moved on. In the legal vocabulary of 18th century England, the phrase carried a weight that is almost impossible to fully translate into modern terms. Pleading the belly, 4 words that had been embedded in English common law for centuries. 4 words that, in the specific context of the Admiralty Court at Spanish Town in November 1720, represented the last available move on a board where almost everything else had already been played. Both Anne Bonny and Mary Read announced, in the formal language of the court, that they were pregnant. and that announcement activated a legal doctrine that had been in place in English law since the medieval period, grounded not just in jurisprudence but in theology. The logic behind it was this: the unborn child had committed no crime. Whatever the mother had done, the child she was carrying was innocent of it. To execute a pregnant woman was therefore not merely to end the life of a convicted criminal, it was to end the life of an innocent person who had not been charged, had not been tried, and could not by any reasonable moral standard be considered guilty of anything. The law, shaped by a culture that took the innocence of unborn life seriously as a theological principle, could not sanction that. A pregnant woman sentenced to death received a stay of execution. Not a pardon, not a commutation. A stay, a delay, measured in months. Until after the child was born and the state of pregnancy no longer provided a legal basis for postponing the sentence. After the birth, the execution would proceed. The plea did not save you. It bought time. The court at Spanish Town had no discretion in this matter. The law was clear. The women claimed pregnancy. The law required that the claims be examined, and so the examination was ordered, which in the context of 1720 meant a formal physical assessment conducted by physicians and overseen by court officials. A process that was clinical and humiliating and entirely without regard for the personhood of the women being examined. Both Anne and Mary were confirmed to be pregnant. The court entered the stays of execution. The hangings that had been scheduled were cancelled, replaced by orders to return both women to prison to await the births of their children. Think about what the plea required of them beyond the words themselves. It required trusting that the legal doctrine would be applied. It required submitting to a physical examination before court officials. It required accepting months of imprisonment in conditions that were brutal by any measure in exchange for the specific and uncertain hope that something might change during those months. It required choosing indefinite suffering now over certain death on a particular date. These are not easy calculations. They are the calculations of people who are still not done, people who can still see possibilities even in a situation that is compressed to almost nothing. There is something in the act of pleading the belly that is its own form of defiance, and I think it is worth naming. Anne Bonny and Mary Read had just sat through a trial that found them guilty of exactly the same crimes as every man on that crew. They had watched the men convicted and sentenced. They had seen the legal machinery perform its function with its characteristic efficiency. They had not been given time to mount any meaningful defence. They had been asked questions about their character and their femininity that had nothing to do with the specific charges against them. They had, in other words, been processed. And yet, they were not done processing. They said 4 words that the court had to accommodate. One last time they made the system adapt to them rather than the other way around. One last assertion that they were not simply objects to be processed, they were people with one more move available. The contrast with the men is worth sitting with for a moment. Calico Jack and the male crew members were hanged within days of their convictions. The whole sequence for them was swift, theatrical, and complete. They were tried, condemned, executed, and gibbeted in a time frame measured in days. Their punishment was public and had a clear ending. And then it was over, and they were gone from the active concerns of anyone who had business to attend to. Anne and Mary were returned to prison, not to the gallows, to a cell, to a facility designed for short-term detention of people awaiting execution, to a place that had not been built with any thought for what it would mean to house someone there for months, to a tropical Caribbean prison in 1720, pregnant, with a death sentence hanging over them that had been suspended but not removed. The men received a quick death. The women received something designed to be slower. And in that difference, in the specific choice to return them to a place that would grind them down over months rather than ending the question cleanly, the system revealed exactly what it was trying to accomplish. Spanish Town Prison in November of 1720 was not what the word prison calls to mind for anyone alive today. There were no modern facilities, no medical staff, no standards of sanitation codified in law and enforced by inspectors. What existed was a structure: stone walls, stone floors, stone ceilings, built not to rehabilitate or even necessarily to confine people over long periods, but to hold them briefly while the machinery of colonial justice arranged their next and final appointment. The cells were small, not small in the way that a cramped bedroom is small in the way that a storage room is small, perhaps 10 feet by 8, perhaps less, with walls thick enough that the heat conducted through them slowly all day as the tropical sun beat on the stone outside. These were cells designed to hold a person for days, perhaps a few weeks. They had never been conceived as places where someone would spend months. Picture what the heat does inside a stone building in the Caribbean. Picture the sun rising over Spanish Town and beginning to work on the exterior walls of the prison. Stone is a remarkable conductor of solar energy. Through the morning hours, the stone absorbs heat. Through the afternoon, the absorption accelerates. By the middle of the day, the interior temperature of those cells would have been extraordinary, not dangerous in the way that the open desert is dangerous, but sustained, pressing, unavoidable. There was no ventilation to speak of. Whatever openings existed in the walls to admit air were small enough to limit the movement of any cooling breeze, while remaining large enough to admit insects in any quantity they chose. The nights would have offered some relief, the Caribbean evening eventually dropping towards something approaching comfort, but then the morning would come and the stone would begin absorbing again. What about the sanitation? This is the question that the official records simply do not engage with, because sanitation in 18th century Caribbean prisons was not a subject that official records tracked. What we know from the general conditions of facilities like this is that waste was collected irregularly, that the stone floors were not cleaned in any systematic way, that the proximity of multiple prisoners to their own biological processes was a constant feature of the environment. The rats did not need to be invited, the insects did not need permission. In the tropics, where life of all kinds grows at an accelerated pace, the things that make a prison unhealthy arrived and multiplied with the same enthusiasm that everything multiplies in that climate. Fresh water was the other critical variable. In Spanish Town in 1720, fresh water for prisoners was not guaranteed. It was provided when it was provided, which was dependent on the attention and inclination of the jailers who were employed to maintain the facility. Some days the water was sufficient, other days it was not. There was no oversight of this. There was no authority to whom a prisoner could report that the water supply had been inadequate. A prisoner in Spanish Town Prison in 1720 was not a person with rights that the facility was obligated to honour. A prisoner was a problem that the facility was warehousing until the problem resolved itself one way or another. Now place a pregnant woman inside this description. Think about what pregnancy requires from a body in the late months of a pregnancy, which is where Anne and Mary almost certainly were by the time their trial concluded in late November 1720. A pregnant body in its later stages needs more nutrition than a non-pregnant body, more protein, more iron, more calories overall. It needs more water. It needs more rest, which is difficult to achieve in a hot stone cell. It needs to avoid infection, which is difficult in a facility that processes disease as efficiently as Spanish Town processed prisoners. It needs, as it approaches the final weeks, some form of medical attendance, someone who knows what they are doing, who has clean hands, who can respond to the complications that childbirth in the 18th century produced with a frequency that we have almost entirely erased from the modern world. None of these things were available. None of them had been considered by the court when it returned the women to prison. The court had applied the law that required the delay of execution. The law said nothing about what conditions the delay must be served in. The law said nothing about what medical care a pregnant woman awaiting delayed execution was entitled to. The law, in this specific dimension, simply did not engage with what had happened after it had exercised its technical mercy by not immediately killing a pregnant woman. Whatever happened to her in the cell was what happened. That was the system working as designed. This is the specific cruelty that needs to be named directly, because it tends to get softened in the accounts that emphasize the legal drama of the trial and the pleading of the belly and the confirmed pregnancies. The cruelty was not that they were kept alive. It was how they were kept alive, and what keeping them alive in those conditions would inevitably produce. A man who is hanged is dead in a matter of minutes. His suffering, such as it is, has a definable endpoint that arrives quickly. What the court chose for Anne and Mary was different. It was months of incremental suffering in conditions that the court knew, or should have known, were likely to be fatal without any act the court was required to acknowledge as deliberate. If the conditions killed them, the records would say fever. If the pregnancy complications killed them, the records would say fever. Fever was the official explanation for almost everything that killed people in Caribbean prisons in this era. It covered a range of specific horrors: typhus, dysentery, malaria, puerperal fever following childbirth, sepsis from any one of the untreated infections that 18th century prisoners were routinely exposed to. Fever was accurate in the narrow sense of being a symptom, and it served the additional function of putting the cause of death at a comfortable remove from anything the legal system had done. The slowness was the point. Not the killing, the slowness. A quick death would have given these women something. A dramatic ending. A definitive moment. A date on which to hang a story. What the prison offered was erosion. Week by week, the conditions worked on bodies that were already stressed by pregnancy, already depleted by months of imprisonment, already disconnected from any support system that might have cushioned the damage. There was no one coming to advocate for better conditions. There was no wealthy patron monitoring their health from outside. There was no legal authority to whom anyone could appeal on their behalf. There was only the cell and the heat and the inadequate water and whatever the fever decided to do when it arrived. Mary Read's fever came in the early weeks of 1721. The specific date is not preserved. The records note the fever and its eventual outcome, but not its precise onset. What we know is that it was severe enough to be identified as the cause of her death in the formal record, which in this era typically meant that a fever had progressed past the point where it was going to resolve without intervention. In a modern hospital with modern medicine and the specific knowledge developed over 3 centuries about what different fever-producing pathogens require for treatment, many of the things that could have killed Mary Read in that cell would be survivable. In Spanish Town in 1721, they were not survivable. Not without resources, not without care, not without someone for whom her survival was a priority rather than a complication. She died in April 1721, roughly 5 months after her conviction. Whether she had given birth before she died is unclear. Whether a child survived if born is equally unclear. The parish records for St. Catherine in Jamaica, the parish that covered Spanish Town, record a burial. An unmarked burial, no gravestone, no ceremony that anyone noted, no family member present to mark the location, no record of what words, if any, were said. Mary Read, who had survived a childhood constructed entirely of necessary deception, who had served in a military campaign in Flanders, who had maintained a secret identity for the better part of 2 decades across multiple countries and multiple vocations, who had stood on the deck of a sloop in Dry Harbour Bay and fought when every man around her chose the hold. That person was placed in the ground of Jamaica without a name above her head. The burial without a marker is the last act of the system's attempt to manage the problem that Mary Read represented. A marked grave is a location. A location is something people can find, something people can visit and stand before and remember and talk about and bring others to see. An unmarked grave is not a location, it is an absence. It is the earth taking something back without acknowledgement. The court at Spanish Town, in its way, wanted to take Mary Read back without acknowledgement. It wanted to complete the process of her disappearance that the prison had been working on since November. The unmarked grave was the final act of that process. She had been found. She had been tried. She had been contained. She had been allowed to die. She had been buried without a name. The process was complete. It did not work. Her name is still here. Anne Bonny's story does not end in a prison cell. It ends in something arguably stranger, a deliberate, structured silence in the official record, a silence so complete and so specific that it speaks as clearly as any document could about what was happening beneath it. After her conviction in late November 1720, after her pregnancy was confirmed and her death sentence was stayed, Anne Bonny was returned to Spanish Town Prison, and then, at some point in the months that followed, she simply disappears. There is no execution record, no death certificate, no record of the sentence being carried out at any date, no record of the sentence being commuted or the case being reviewed, no record of her release. The historical record contains her through the trial date and then contains nothing. The gap where Anne Bonny should be is one of those archival silences that historians have been arguing about for 3 centuries, and the argument is still ongoing because the silence is genuine and has resisted every attempt to fill it with certainty. What the silence is not is accidental. Records of colonial admiralty proceedings in this era were kept carefully because the courts understood that their proceedings were both legal events and political demonstrations, and demonstrations needed documentation to be usable. The death of Calico Jack is documented. The deaths of every other male crew member are documented. The death of Mary Read is documented. The absence of any documentation about Anne Bonny's fate is not an oversight. Something happened that someone did not want documented, or something was documented and then subsequently removed, or something happened entirely outside the formal record-keeping system in a way that produced no official paper trail. The most widely accepted theory among historians who have studied this question carefully is that Anne Bonny's father intervened. William Cormac, by 1720, was not the man who had left County Cork in something like disgrace. He was a prosperous and established Charleston merchant, a man with money and connections, and the specific kind of influence that money and connections produce in a colonial system where formal authority was often more negotiable than it officially presented itself to be. He had disowned Anne when she married James Bonny. That disownment was a public act, a formal severance intended to communicate that he was not responsible for whatever his daughter chose to do with herself. But a daughter publicly hanged for piracy was a different problem from a daughter whose scandalous marriage had been disowned. One was a private scandal, the other was a permanent public event attached to his family name. Colonial justice in the Caribbean in 1720 was not the sealed, inviolable system that it presented itself as in formal proceedings. It was a human system, operated by human beings who had financial situations and personal relationships and various degrees of vulnerability to the kinds of pressures that wealthy men knew how to apply. Governors communicated with London through channels that were slow and often imprecise. Local authorities had room for interpretation in their application of imperial directives. Judges were men who had mortgages and relationships and social ambitions that could be shaped by the right conversation with the right person. Jailers were certainly men who had financial situations. The specific mechanism by which a death sentence in a colonial admiralty court could be quietly set aside without formal documentation was not mysterious. It required money, and it required someone with the right connections in the right places, and it almost certainly required agreement from Anne herself about what her life after the intervention would look like. Think about what that agreement would have required. If William Cormac paid someone, or multiple someones, to arrange his daughter's quiet release, the price was not only financial. The price was Anne's return to the world she had fled, the return to respectability, the return to being someone's property under the law, which meant finding a husband and becoming his wife and disappearing back into the structure that she had stolen a ship to escape from. You could not be released from a piracy conviction as yourself, as Anne Bonny, the person who had said to her dying lover that he should have fought like a man. You had to become someone else. A new name, a new location, a new social identity that had no connection to the woman the newspapers had covered and the court had convicted. The system would not spit you back out as the pirate. The system would spit you back out as someone's wife. The theory that has attracted the most sustained attention from historians is the theory that Anne Bonny became Anne Burley, a woman recorded in South Carolina documents, a woman who appears to have lived a quiet and entirely conventional life, a woman who married, who had children, who was buried in a family plot somewhere in South Carolina in 1782. If this theory is correct, and it is the most plausible explanation for the archival silence, then Anne Bonny lived to be in her mid-80s. She outlived Mary Read by more than 60 years. She outlived most of the people who had known her in Nassau and on the water. She outlived the era itself by 1782. The Golden Age of Piracy was history that young people learned about in books, not a lived reality that any significant number of people could personally remember. What that long life required of her, what the terms of survival demanded, is the disturbing part of this theory. Not that she survived. Survival is not disturbing, but the specific form that survival took. She had to perform, for decades, exactly the role she had committed an act of piracy to escape. She had to be someone's wife. She had to be someone's mother. She had to be a respectable woman in a colonial society that had very specific ideas about what respectable women looked like and did and said and were permitted to think about themselves. She had to carry the years on the water as an interior secret, shared with no one who could not be trusted absolutely, perhaps shared with no one at all. The Anne Bonny who had stood on a deck and fought while men hid below had to be contained inside the Anne Burley who appeared to everyone around her as a conventional woman living a conventional life. And yet, and this is the thing that I cannot stop thinking about, she knew. Whatever the external life required of her, she carried the truth of herself on the inside, inaccessible to anyone who looked at her from outside. She had done it. She had stolen the ship. She had sailed. She had fought, and not for decoration, not for show, but because the situation required it, and she was one of the 2 people on that crew who responded to the situation correctly. She had looked at the man she had loved in his last hours and told him the truth about himself without softening it. She had been for 2 years exactly herself in a way that the world said she could not be. And no amount of subsequent respectability could take that knowledge away from inside her. The contrast between Anne's probable fate and Mary Read's certain one is the most revealing thing about how the system actually worked, and I want to be precise about what the difference was. Because it is important to be precise about this. The difference was not that Anne was less guilty. They were convicted of the same crimes. The difference was not that the court found Anne more sympathetic. The testimony suggested they were equally ferocious. The difference was that Anne Bonny had a father with money who had a reason to spend it on her behalf. Mary Read had no one. Mary Read had a dead husband who had been a modest innkeeper near Breda. She had a mother who had made do with deception and had never had wealth. She had no connection to anyone in the colonial system with the standing to intervene. She was, in the relevant sense, entirely alone, and that aloneness was the thing that killed her. Not the fever specifically, not the prison specifically, the aloneness. The absence of anyone whose wealth and connections could move between her and the consequence of her choices. Power in the 18th century, for a woman, almost always flowed through men. Anne Bonny had a man with power who, however belatedly and however reluctantly, chose to exercise it on her behalf. Mary Read had no such man. The difference between their outcomes was not a difference in what they had done, or what they deserved, or even what the court had decided. It was a difference in who had access to the leverage that the system could be moved by. And that difference is the truest, most honest thing the whole story has to tell us about how the world worked in 1720. It is also, in its essential structure, not entirely unfamiliar from where we stand today. The story of Anne Bonny and Mary Read is the most famous version of this story. It is the version the records preserved most thoroughly, the version the 1724 book carried into the popular imagination, the version that has been retold in plays and novels and films for 3 centuries. But it is not the only version. Wherever you look in the history of women who stepped outside the maritime roles assigned to them, in the European Middle Ages, in the waters of Scandinavia, in the South China Sea, in the colonial Caribbean in the decades after the Rackham trial, you find the same fundamental pattern with the same fundamental structure. The specific legal mechanisms differ. The specific forms of punishment differ. The cultures and the languages differ. But the underlying dynamic is consistent enough across centuries and oceans to be something more than coincidence. It is a pattern. And the pattern, examined carefully, tells you more about the system than any individual case can tell you on its own. Go back further than 1720. Go to medieval and early modern Europe, to the period between roughly 1300 and 1600, when maritime raiding was not yet the organised, article-governed enterprise that the Golden Age of Piracy would eventually produce, but was instead a more chaotic and regional phenomenon: Scandinavian raiders, Barbary corsairs, coastal communities in England and France and Ireland that turned to raiding as a supplement to whatever other economic activity was available to them. In this period, women who were found to have participated in maritime raiding faced consequences that had very specific characteristics, and those characteristics are worth examining because they reappear with remarkable fidelity in every subsequent era. Women captured during maritime raids were not simply taken to trial. They were displayed. The displaying came first, before any formal legal proceeding, before any court had determined guilt or innocence or appropriate punishment. They were paraded through the streets of the port towns where they were brought. Not taken directly from the ship to the jail, taken from the ship to the street and walked through it in front of as many people as could be gathered or attracted to the procession. Think about what this meant. The displaying was not a legal event. It had no formal standing in any court proceeding. It was a social event, a public communication that was happening before the law got involved, saying something to the watching crowd that the law would later say in more formal terms. It was the community asserting its position on what it was looking at. It was the social order pre-announcing its verdict even before the official verdict had been rendered. The clothing that these women were made to wear during display proceedings was often specifically chosen for its meaning. Women who had been found in men's clothing were stripped of it and forced into garments that were explicitly and exaggeratedly feminine, not the garments of respectable women, but the garments of a particular female type that the community understood as degraded, as deviant in the specific direction of sexual dishonour rather than maritime courage. The choice was deliberate. By stripping the male clothing and replacing it with the garments of a dishonourable woman, the ritual was saying, your attempt to occupy the male category is cancelled, and you are returned to the female category, but returned to its worst expression, because someone who tried to leave deserves to come back to the worst version of what she was trying to leave. The symbolic violence of this was not subtle, it was entirely the point. And then there was witchcraft. This is the element of the historical pattern that is most disturbing in what it reveals about how the cultural system processed the threat of female maritime violence. In the medieval and early modern periods, when a woman was found to have participated in raiding, to have fought or commanded, or organised, the accusation of witchcraft was not unusual. It was, in many documented cases, almost expected. The logic was this: a woman who could fight like a man must have accessed powers that women did not naturally possess. The natural woman was not capable of violence of this kind, of courage of this kind, of command of this kind. The evidence that this particular woman was capable of it was right in front of everyone. Therefore something supernatural had enabled her. Therefore she must have made some kind of arrangement with forces that were, by the theological understanding of the era, necessarily dark. Think about what the witchcraft accusation accomplished that a simple piracy accusation did not. A piracy accusation was a criminal charge. It said, you did a specific illegal thing and you will be punished for it. A witchcraft accusation was something else entirely. It said, you are not a person who made bad choices. You are a different kind of thing from what you appear. Something has corrupted you at a fundamental level. Something has entered into you that makes you capable of acts that ordinary women cannot commit. The witchcraft accusation moved the question from what she did to what she is, and in doing so it accomplished the specific thing the system most needed to accomplish. It denied the demonstration, because if she had done these things through supernatural means, through dark powers that ordinary women could not access, then her example did not apply to ordinary women. It was not evidence that the walls were crossable. It was evidence of an extraordinary corruption. It was a story about why this particular case was different from every other case, rather than a story about what any woman with sufficient courage and determination might be capable of. Inquisitions, as history has demonstrated repeatedly, were designed to produce confessions rather than discover truth, and a woman who had been accused of witchcraft alongside piracy faced a proceeding that was structured not to evaluate the evidence of what she had done, but to extract the admission that would explain it. That she had made a pact, that she had received powers, that she had been corrupted by dark forces, that her courage and her capability were not hers at all, but borrowed from something inhuman. The confession, once extracted, and the methods for extracting it were effective if not accurate, would then serve as the explanation. It would inoculate the community against the demonstration she had made. She had not proven that women could do these things. She had proven that dark powers could use a woman's body to do these things. The distinction was everything. The famous Burka warrior burial discovered in Sweden and fully analysed and published in 2017 is a piece of this history that arrives from a completely different direction. The burial was found in the Swedish town of Burka, dating to the Viking Age, approximately the 10th century. The grave contained the skeleton of a person surrounded by the full equipment of a military commander. Weapons, armour, 2 horses, a gaming set that represented strategic planning ability, the kind of burial assemblage that, when found in a male skeleton, is classified without hesitation as the burial of a warrior or military leader. For a century after its discovery, the burial was assumed to be male. When DNA analysis was conducted in 2017, it confirmed that the skeleton was female. The burial goods were exactly what they appeared to be. This person had been buried as what she was, a warrior, a leader, someone whose community acknowledged her military identity without apparent hesitation. The archaeological record does not tell us what happened to female warriors who were captured by enemy forces in the Viking Age, but the consistent pattern from adjacent historical periods suggests that whatever happened to them was very different from what happened to male captives. The pattern is consistent. What happens to female maritime raiders when they are captured by forces that consider female warriors to be unnatural depends on who has the power in the encounter and what that power is designed to protect. In medieval Europe, the answer is public humiliation rituals and witchcraft accusations. In the colonial Caribbean, the answer is a gender-specific trial procedure and a prison that functions as slow execution. In the decades following the Rackham trial, the answer was new laws passed specifically to address the problem that Anne and Mary had exposed. Because that is what happened. The trial of 1720 was not just a legal proceeding, it was also a legislative event. In the years and decades after the Rackham trial, several colonial legislatures in the Caribbean examined their existing piracy statutes and found them inadequate for the specific problem that Anne Bonny and Mary Read had presented. The women had been convicted under the existing statutes, yes, but the existing statutes had not anticipated women. They had not addressed the possibility of female crew members. They had not provided specific guidance for what to do with a woman found in men's clothing aboard a pirate vessel. And so the legislatures updated them. Some of the amendments that followed made it explicitly illegal for women to serve aboard any vessel without the written permission of a male relative or guardian. Think about the specificity of this. Not. Women cannot commit piracy. That was already covered by the existing law. The new provision was, women cannot be on ships without male permission. The act of being aboard a vessel, not the act of raiding, not the act of fighting, not the act of stealing cargo, but the simple act of being on a ship without a man's authorization, was legislated against. As though the lesson learned from Anne and Mary was not that piracy was bad, but that female mobility was the dangerous thing, and female mobility was the thing that needed to be restricted. Other amendments created additional penalties for women found aboard ships in disguise. Dressing as a man, which had not been a separate criminal offence under the existing law, became one. The discovery of female identity aboard a pirate vessel was not merely evidence in the piracy case. It was, under the new provisions, an independent offence requiring independent punishment. The disguise itself was criminalised, as though the court was trying to build a legal barrier not just against female piracy, but against the specific method by which female piracy had been accomplished. Against the act of inhabiting a category you had not been assigned. Women convicted of piracy-adjacent crimes in the Caribbean in the decades following 1720 faced combinations of punishment that male pirates never encountered. The gibbet was not for them, that was for men, and the gibbet at least had the quality of being over quickly. What awaited women was a sequence. They were displayed in stocks, not for hours, but for days, in the public spaces of port towns, where the largest number of people could see them. They were branded, the iron pressed to their skin in visible places, on the cheek or the hand or the forearm, leaving a permanent mark that every subsequent employer, every subsequent social encounter, every person who looked at them for the rest of their lives would see and could ask about. The brand was designed to ensure that no future life could escape what had happened. No new city, no new name, no attempt at reinvention could fully succeed, because the proof of the court's verdict was written into the skin, and the imprisonment was extended, not because the legal terms required it, but because extended imprisonment was itself understood as a punishment appropriate to the specific nature of the crime. These were not practical delays like the one that pregnancy had created. These were deliberate sentences of duration, intended to ensure that the woman who emerged from prison, if she emerged, was not the same woman who had entered it. The goal was not to execute her quickly. The goal was to return her to the world as a diminished thing, as a woman who had been thoroughly processed by the system and was now marked by it in ways that could not be removed or hidden. The punishment was designed to be worn on the outside of the body, forever, as a constant reminder to anyone who encountered it of what stepping outside the designated role had cost. The cruelty was deliberate. It was calculated. It was not the cruelty of individual malice, though individual malice was certainly present in some of the people administering these punishments. It was the cruelty of a system that understood the specific threat that female autonomy represented to the social order, and that had decided to answer that threat in the most comprehensive way available to it. A man who commits piracy threatens shipping lanes. A woman who commits piracy threatens the idea that the categories are real, and the categories being real was foundational to everything. Marriage law, property law, the administration of colonial economies that depended on the labour of people assigned specific roles by the social order. The family structure that produced heirs and transmitted property and maintained the specific version of civilization the empire was trying to build. All of it rested on the assumption that the categories, male, female, their rights and restrictions and designated spaces were not conventions but facts. Female pirates said they were conventions. The system responded accordingly. Now go east. Go to the South China Sea in the early years of the 19th century, not because it is a cheerful counterpoint, but because it is the most instructive exception in this entire history. And exceptions illuminate rules in ways that additional examples of the rules cannot. Qing Shi was born around 1775 in Guangdong province on the southern coast of China. Her birth name is lost to history. The name she is known by simply means widow of Qing, which is itself a kind of historical commentary about how her story has been told and filed. She grew up in circumstances that the official record does not preserve in detail, and came to work as a sex worker aboard a floating brothel in Canton Harbour. This is where she met Zhong Yi, a man who commanded a significant pirate confederation in the South China Sea. A man whose family had roots in piracy going back generations, a man who wanted to marry her. She did not simply accept the proposal. She negotiated the terms. She would marry him if she received an equal share in the fleet and co-equal authority in military decisions. Zhong Yi agreed. She was approximately 26 years old. Picture what that negotiation required. In the China of 1801, the legal and social position of women was not one that offered many of the protections or rights that even the limited law of the European colonial world extended to women of property. A woman's legal existence was almost entirely dependent on the men around her, and yet a woman working in a floating brothel in Canton Harbour looked at a pirate commander who wanted to marry her and said, equal share, co-equal authority, or no. And he said yes. And the marriage that followed changed the history of the South China Sea. Together they expanded the Red Flag Fleet, as Zheng Yi's confederation was known, to a scale that had no precedent in the region, They brought previously independent commanders into the Confederation through military pressure, strategic marriage arrangements, and economic structures that gave smaller fleet operators a genuine stake in the success of the larger organization. By 1807, when Jing Yi died in a typhoon near Vietnam, the Confederation numbered hundreds of ships and tens of thousands of sailors. This is the moment where almost every story of a woman in this era would end. The husband dies. The wife is absorbed into someone else's household, her authority dissolved, her function reduced to mourning and compliance. This is not what happened. Within weeks of her husband's death, Qing Shi moved to consolidate her position at the head of the Red Flag Fleet. She secured the loyalty of Zhang Bao, her late husband's most effective military commander. She established a formal code of laws governing the Confederation's operations, a genuine legal system, not a set of vague principles, governing everything from the distribution of plunder to the treatment of captives to the punishment of cowardice in battle. She enforced that code with consistency and, when necessary, with ferocity. At the height of her power, Qing Shi commanded approximately 1,800 ships and 80,000 sailors. These are numbers that should be allowed to sit for a moment, because they tend to be stated and then immediately moved past, and they should not be moved past quickly. 1,800 ships. 80,000 people. Blackbeard, at his most theatrical, commanded perhaps 4 ships and 400 men. The most successful pirate of the Caribbean Golden Age, Bartholomew Roberts, captured an estimated 400 vessels over 3 years and commanded several hundred crew at his peak. Qing Shi commanded an organization roughly 200 times larger in human terms than anything the Atlantic world produced. She did so for years. She defeated in open water the combined naval forces of the Chinese Qing dynasty, the Portuguese Empire, and the British East India Company simultaneously in the same campaign. She was never beaten in battle by anyone. When she eventually decided to retire, she chose the moment herself. In 1810, she negotiated a settlement with the Qing government from a position of undefeated military strength. The settlement she secured was extraordinary. She kept her wealth. She received guarantees of safety for herself and her commanders. Zhang Bao was absorbed into the Qing military at a rank commensurate with his actual command experience, which was very high. Qing Shi retired from active piracy and eventually operated a gambling house in Canton, a business that was technically illegal, but that ran with the kind of informal tolerance from authorities that suggests her former power still cast a shadow long after she stopped commanding a fleet. She died in 1844, at approximately 69 years of age, in her own house, surrounded by family. She died wealthy. She died on her own terms. She died old. Qing Shi's outcome is not evidence that the system treated powerful women differently in some fundamental way. It is evidence of a different principle, one that helps explain why every other woman in this story met a different fate. Qing Shi had 80,000 sailors. When she sat across a table from Qing dynasty officials and discussed terms, she had something they desperately wanted, the end of a threat they had been unable to defeat. She could negotiate because she had something worth trading. She could retire because she could make retirement the price of stopping, rather than a gift the Empire chose to give her. The protection she had was not the protection of being a woman who had earned special consideration. It was the protection of being an undefeated military commander with a fleet large enough that destroying her was more expensive than accommodating her. The moment that leverage disappeared, had she ever been captured without her fleet, had she been taken the way Anne and Mary were taken, in the dark of a Caribbean night by a privateer whose crew outnumbered hers, the story would have been different. The same courts that had failed to defeat her militarily would have processed her with exactly the same machinery that processed Anne Bonny and Mary Read. The same questions about her character, the same testimony about her behaviour, the same conclusions about the specific crime of being the wrong kind of woman. What protected Qingxi was not her gender, and not her virtue, and not any principle about how female captives should be treated. What protected her was that nobody had managed to make her a captive. The principle the comparison illustrates is this: women who threatened the existing order could escape the consequences of that threat only if they possessed a countervailing power large enough to make the consequences impractical. Qingxi had 80,000 sailors. Anne Bonny had a wealthy father who chose eventually to spend his resources on her behalf in exchange for her agreement to disappear. Mary Read had nothing and no one and died in a cell. The comparison is not between 3 different outcomes for 3 different women. It is between 3 different levels of available leverage and the way the system responded to each. The pattern that stretches across centuries and oceans, from medieval European port towns to the colonial Caribbean to the South China Sea, is not coincidence. It is not a series of unrelated decisions made by different courts in different cultures, all arriving independently at similar conclusions. It is a pattern that reveals something consistent about what the threat was and why the response took the forms it took. What female pirates threatened was not commerce. They were not, in most cases, large enough operations to represent serious economic threats. Calico Jack's crew stole from fishing boats and small trading sloops. Anne and Mary were not disrupting the major trade routes. The economic damage they caused was real but modest. What they threatened was the idea. The demonstration. The visible, embodied, undeniable proof that a woman could do what they had done. That she could choose the horizon. That she could survive on the water alongside men, fight alongside men, make decisions alongside men, and be respected for it, not because the law permitted it, but because her competence earned it in a context where competence was what determined respect. That demonstration, if it spread, if it was allowed to be told and retold, if other women heard about it and thought about it, and arrived at the conclusion that the walls were crossable, was worth more in danger to the social order than any number of stolen cargoes. Because the social order of the early 18th century depended, structurally and legally and practically, on women staying within the space assigned to them. Marriage law depended on it. Property law depended on it. The administration of colonial economies that required clearly assigned labour roles depended on it. The family structures that transmitted wealth and produced legitimate heirs depended on it. None of these systems were designed to accommodate women who had decided their own roles. All of them would require renegotiation in a world where women were permitted to make that decision. The court at Spanish Town needed remorseful women. It needed fallen women. Women who had been led astray by bad men, by poverty, by the specific moral weaknesses that women were supposed to be susceptible to, and who were now, having been caught and corrected by the law, returning to their senses. Women who would weep and ask for mercy and perform the kind of contrition that confirmed the natural order had been temporarily disrupted and had now reasserted itself. Women who would, by their remorse, acknowledge that what they had done was wrong in the deepest sense, not merely illegal, but unnatural. Women who would, by their performance of proper femininity in the dock, inoculate the watching gallery against the demonstration their lives had made. Anne Bonny did not give them that. She told Jack Rackham in his last hours that he should have fought better. She did not perform sorrow. She did not ask for mercy. She did not collapse under the weight of what the court was doing to her. She assessed the situation with the same clarity she had always brought to situations that required assessment, and she told the truth of what she saw. The court could not use that. They could not hold it up to the watching public and say, look, she has been broken. Look, she acknowledges the wrongness of her choices. Look, the natural order has reasserted itself. She refused to be the evidence the system needed. Mary Read defended her profession on philosophical grounds to the judges who were about to sentence her to die for practicing it. She argued that the death penalty was valuable not as a deterrent to her, but as a quality filter for the trade. Only people of genuine courage would enter a profession that carried death as its guaranteed endpoint. She was making a case, in her own defence, not for mercy, but for the institutional usefulness of the law that was killing her. The transcripts show the judges moving past her statement without engagement. They did not know what to do with it. It did not fit any category they had available for processing a woman on trial for piracy. The 1724 book changed what the system could accomplish with its silence. In the years after the trial, the official apparatus had done what official apparatuses do after dealing with a threat. It had closed the files, executed the men, managed the women, and moved on. Anne Bonny's name appeared in the records through November 1720, and then did not appear. Mary Read's name appeared in a burial record in the parish of St. Catherine, and then did not appear. The court at Spanish Town moved on to other cases. The governor's correspondence moved on to other topics. The gibbet above Port Royal Harbour held what remained of Calico Jack until the weather and the birds reduced it to what weather and birds reduce things to. And then it was removed, and the entrance to the harbour looked the way it had always looked. And then the book appeared. A General History of the Pirates, published in London in 1724 under the name of Captain Charles Johnson, a pseudonym that most historians now believe concealed Daniel Defoe, the author of Robinson Crusoe, though the question is not fully settled. The book contained the stories of Anne Bonny and Mary Read in detail that went far beyond what any official record preserved. Their origins, their lives before the sea, the specific texture of how they had come to be on that sloop. The trial. The pleading of the belly. Mary's death. Anne's disappearance. It was part history and part storytelling, and the line between the two was not always clearly marked. But the core of it was documented by sources the author had clearly been able to access. The book became popular in a way that the official court proceedings had never been intended to become popular. People across England and the colonies read it. The stories of Anne and Mary circulated in drawing rooms and taverns, and on ships, and in the colonial ports. Women read them. Women who were not pirates, who would never be pirates, who had no intention of ever standing on the deck of a sloop with a pistol in each hand. Women who were living the lives they were supposed to live, moving within the boundaries they were supposed to stay within. And some of those women, reading about Anne Bonny and Mary Read, felt something shift in how they understood what was possible. Felt the specific small shock of recognizing that the categories were not as fixed as the world had agreed to present them. This is what the system at Spanish Town had been trying to prevent, not just the piracy. The idea that the walls were crossable, the knowledge, once possessed, that someone had crossed them. The plays and poems and songs that followed the 1724 book were evidence that the suppression had failed. The legend of Anne Bonny and Mary Read spread in ways that the official apparatus could not control, because the apparatus only controlled official channels, and the legend was travelling through unofficial ones. 3 centuries later, the names are still here. The court at Spanish Town is not. The Admiralty records it produced survive in archives that almost no one consults. But the names are in the mouths of people who tell stories to other people in the dark, and the stories say there were women who chose the horizon. The walls are not inherent. Other women have looked at the distance between where they were and where they wanted to be, and they have crossed it. That is the thing the system was punishing. Not the raiding, not the stolen rum and the threatened fishing boats and the modest prizes taken from modest trading sloops along the Jamaican coast. The thing the system was punishing was that knowledge. The specific, dangerous, undeniable knowledge that some women had demonstrated by living their lives outside the category assigned to them. The knowledge that it was possible. The court at Spanish Town understood this clearly enough to design its punishments with it in mind, to choose slow erosion over quick execution, public shaming over straightforward conviction, the deliberate creation of marked and diminished women over the accidental creation of dramatic martyrs. The system understood the threat it was responding to. It responded as comprehensively as it knew how. The names are still here. That is the story's last word on how the response worked out. It is late now. Wherever you are in the world, the night has probably deepened since you started listening. The sounds of the earlier hours, traffic, voices, whatever fills the background of wherever you are, have probably quieted. The room around you has settled into its nighttime version of itself, which is always slightly different from its daytime version. Quieter, more specific. The kinds of stillness that only happen when most of the world has stopped moving. I find myself, at the end of a story like this one, not quite in the space of sadness, and not quite in the space of anything that has a simple name. There is something that comes from sitting with history long enough to feel it as something that actually happened, not as text, not as dates and proper nouns in a book, but as lives. As specific people in specific places making specific choices under specific pressures, none of whom had any way of knowing that, 3 centuries later. Someone would be telling their story in the dark to people who might be in any room in any corner of the world. Mary Read died in April of 1721. She died in a stone cell in Spanish Town, Jamaica, in conditions that the prison had not been designed to make survivable. She was buried in the parish of St. Catherine, without a marker above her grave. She was, in the intentions of the court and the system that court represented, supposed to disappear. To be the cautionary tale told in general terms without names, the warning without a protagonist, the proof that stepping outside the designated role produced a consequence so private and so unremarkable that even the consequence could not become a symbol. She was supposed to vanish without leaving a shape in the air where she had been. She did not vanish. She left her name. She left the record of her trial. She left the testimony of witnesses who described her fighting while men hid. She left everything the 1724 book preserved about the life she had lived before and during the 2 years on the water. She is here, in this story, tonight, in whatever room you are listening from. 300 years after the court at Spanish Town tried to erase her, her name is being said aloud. Anne Bonny, if the most widely believed historical theory is correct, lived until 1782. She was buried in South Carolina in a family plot with a name above her grave that may or may not have been the name she was born with. She had children, perhaps grandchildren. She lived through the American Revolution. She lived through the decades in which the world around her changed in ways that the world of 1720 would not have predicted. She carried inside her, for all of those 60-some years after the night in Dry Harbour Bay, the knowledge of who she had been. The life she had actually lived, in its fullest version, was not the life visible from the outside. Not the respectable wife, not the proper colonial woman, not whoever Anne Burley was in the eyes of her community. The fullest version was the one that had stood on a deck with a pistol in each hand, that had looked at a dying man and told him the truth without softening it, that had sailed in open water and been, for 2 extraordinary years, exactly itself. No one could take that knowledge away from inside her. Not the respectable marriage, not the decades of conventional life, not even the legal requirement to be someone else. The knowledge of who you actually are, of what you are actually capable of what you were when you were most fully yourself, that is not the kind of thing that external circumstances can reach. It is interior. It is yours in a way that nothing external can be yours, because nothing external can be removed from the outside. Qingxie died in 1844, in Canton, in her own house, wealthy and surrounded by family. She had been the most powerful pirate in human history. She had never been defeated. She had chosen her own ending and negotiated its terms from a position of strength. She died old in a way that almost no one who spends decades in the violent business of maritime piracy dies. She outlasted every enemy she made. She retired to a gambling house and lived out her years doing exactly as she pleased. She was 69 years old when she died. The sea had been hers. She had given it up when she was ready to give it up, and not one day before. These are three women whose lives ended in three very different ways. One dead of fever in a stone cell at 35 or so, one probably living to her 80s under a name that was not fully her own, one dying wealthy at 69, having defeated 3 empires. Their endings are not equivalent. The distance between them is the distance that power creates between people. And that distance is not small. But all 3 of them share something that the systems arrayed against them could not remove, which is the fact of what they did. They looked at the horizon, they decided it was theirs, they went. The court at Spanish Town is gone. The gibbet posts above Port Royal Harbour are gone, replaced by the infrastructure of a fishing village and then a tourist destination. The cells in Spanish Town prison are gone. The official records that tried to manage and contain and ultimately erase the problem of female pirates have been sitting in archives for 300 years, mostly undisturbed, doing the quiet work of preservation whether anyone is reading them or not. And the names are still here. The stories are still here. The knowledge is still here that there were women who made this choice, that they survived it for varying lengths of time and in varying forms, that the system that punished them deployed everything it had and did not succeed in making them disappear. Think about what that persistence means, not as a comforting story, not as a tidy narrative in which courage triumphs and justice prevails, because it did not triumph in those specific terms and justice was largely absent, but as something true. The most powerful systems in the early 18th century Atlantic world wanted these women to be forgotten. They deployed public trials and gibbets and stone cells and inadequate food and fevers and unmarked graves and archival silence in the service of that forgetting. And 3 centuries later, someone is telling their story in the dark, and someone is listening. The water is still there. The Caribbean still looks the way it looked in 1720, the same blue-green in the shallows over the reef, the same sudden deep blue where the seafloor drops away, the same trade winds from the northeast in the same seasons. Port Royal is a quiet fishing village now. Spanish Town is still there, though the old Admiralty Court is long gone, the building it occupied serving other purposes or no purposes at all, depending on which part of it you are looking at. The islands are still scattered the way they were scattered then, Dry Harbour Bay still on the western tip of Jamaica, still sheltered enough for a sloop to anchor quietly in the dark. Whatever moved these women, whatever specific quality of wanting made them look at the horizon and decide it belonged to them too, that quality did not disappear with them. It showed up in every era since. It shows up now, in different contexts with different stakes and different consequences, but with the same essential shape. A person in a category assigned to them by someone else, looking at a door that the category says is not for them, deciding to open it anyway. The walls are not inherent. That is what Anne and Mary proved. That is what the court at Spanish Town spent its considerable authority trying to disprove. The court lost. Let everything you've been carrying today settle down a little more completely now. Let your breath find its slowest, most comfortable rhythm. The story is finished, but you can keep it. You can carry it the way we carry the things that matter, not as weight, but as company. The knowledge that there were women who looked at the water in 1718 and 1719 and 1720 and saw it as theirs. The knowledge that the system's response to them was calibrated, deliberate, and comprehensive, designed to erase. The knowledge that it did not fully work. That 3 centuries later, in whatever room you are in whatever part of the world, the names are still arriving through the dark. Sleep well tonight. Thank you for listening. I will have another story waiting for you whenever you are ready. Sweet dreams. There is one more thing about Mary Read's military service in Flanders that deserves to be said before we leave it, because it is easy to let the phrase she served in the military pass without fully inhabiting what it meant. The War of the Spanish Succession, which Mary fought in during the years around 1701 to 1714, was one of the most sustained and brutal conflicts of its era. It was fought primarily in the Low Countries, Belgium and the Netherlands as we would name them now, in terrain that was wet, cold and torn by campaigns that ground forward in siege and counter-siege and set-piece battles across years. The soldiers who served in it, men and women alike, slept in the field in conditions that were cold and damp and frequently diseased. They marched in formations across ground that had been destroyed by repeated military activity. They fought in battles that involved muskets and cannon and close-quarters action with bayonets, in which the noise was deafening and the smoke was blinding, and the physical proximity of violence was something that required an almost inhuman capacity to function within. Mary Read was in that. She was not a camp follower, not attached to the army in a support capacity. She was a soldier. She drilled with the unit. She marched with the unit. She fought with the unit. She received the same physical demands, the same weather, the same disease exposure, the same probability of dying in battle that every man around her accepted as the terms of service. And she did it while maintaining a secret that, if discovered, would have ended everything, not just her career but quite possibly her safety. She managed the secret across the full run of a military campaign. She managed it in the specific conditions where secrets are hardest to keep: close quarters, physical exhaustion, the particular intimacy of men who live and fight and sleep alongside each other for months in difficult terrain. That she maintained it tells you something fundamental about how extraordinary her self-discipline and situational awareness were. Long before she was a pirate, Mary Read had already demonstrated a capacity for operating under pressure that most people never develop in any context. The inn near Breda, after her marriage, represents something worth dwelling on. For perhaps a year, possibly 2, Mary Read lived openly as herself. She was Mary. Not Mark, not whatever male name she had been using in the military. She was a woman, married, running a business, visible in her community under her actual identity. People knew her. They called her by name. She did not have to calculate every sentence for the information it might accidentally reveal. She did not have to be vigilant about the ways a body gives itself away if you are not monitoring it constantly. She was, for the length of that time at the inn, simply a person living a life, rather than a person maintaining a performance. When her husband died and the inn failed, she lost not just financial security but that specific form of ease. The decision to go back into disguise was not made lightly. It was made by someone who had experienced what life without disguise could feel like, and who had then lost access to it, and who had concluded that the alternatives were simply not acceptable. One detail about the aftermath of the Rackham trial that tends to get compressed in retellings, but that matters for understanding the scope of what followed. The colonial newspapers of the era did not merely report the trial. They did something more expansive and more durably influential. They circulated stories about Anne and Mary, not just the legal facts, but the narratives. The detail that the women had fought while the men hid below spread through the colonial press in Jamaica and then in publications further afield, and the spread of that specific detail was significant. Because it was not the kind of detail that made the case for the court's position. It was the kind of detail that complicated it. A narrative in which the female pirates were simply wild women led astray by bad men was a manageable narrative. The system could process that narrative, could hold it up as evidence of female weakness and susceptibility, could use it to reinforce the case for keeping women in protected domestic spaces. But a narrative in which the women fought and the men hid, that was a different story entirely. That was a story in which the women were more capable than the men, more courageous, more willing to meet the situation that the situation required. The newspapers could not help reporting it because it was true, and because it was extraordinary, and because extraordinary true things sell newspapers. But in reporting it, they distributed the very demonstration that the court at Spanish Town had been trying to contain.